What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. All right, I was thinking about it today on my run. What do you guys think? Is Dante's innocent? So let's look over the facts here. Dante's is on a voyage. His captain is dying. His captain gives him deathbed instructions, last wishes. Take this envelope, Dante's, to the Isle of Elba and give it to, the Grand Marshal, Napoleon. Now, he does that because of a sense of duty. The book is very clear. Dante's does not have any ambitions. He's not doing this to try to get ahead for himself. He's doing this because it's a dude's dying wish that he take these messages to Napoleon, right? Now, because he does that, Napoleon starts the 100 Days, right? He goes back to the mainland to seize power, and then he gets defeated at Waterloo. Now, we know from the rest of the events, for instance, in the chapters we just read, where the king finds out that Napoleon is in Lyon and then going to Paris, that this is the case. So Dante's unwittingly was part of the 100 Days. Now, if the ruling power at the time, the government, is saying that Napoleon is a war criminal and he should be exiled to Elba and he shouldn't be in power, then Dante's has committed a crime. However, when Dante's is accused by danglers and taken before Villefort, Villefort has no idea the 100 Days have started, right? He goes to Paris, and that's when everybody finds out that the 100 Days have started. So at the time, Villefort says, listen, you just did some guy's dying wish. You had no idea what was in the envelope. You didn't open it. I'm going to let you go. The only reason Villefort doesn't let him go is because he realizes that the message Napoleon sends to the mainland is to his own father, and that could hurt his father and Villefort's own political ambitions. So Dante's is guilty, I think, sort of, right? Even though he is not trying to overthrow the government, he knows what he's doing. He's taking messages to an exiled war criminal. And that's another thing to think about. Maybe you could try to argue that Dante's doesn't know what he's doing. He's just trying to fulfill the captain's dying wish. But he says that he is old enough that he was almost conscripted right before Napoleon's first defeat. So he knows what's going on in France, right? He's on a vessel. Some of the guys on the ship were probably press-ganged into the military, into the Navy. And even if he's not the most learned kid, Dante's has got to know he's taking messages to an exiled war criminal, and that that's probably not a good thing, even if it is your captain's dying wish. Just because somebody's on their deathbed doesn't mean you have to do what they ask. If I go visit my grandfather in the hospital, and he's like, "Come closer, Dan," and I go, "What, Grandpapa? What do you want?" "My dying wish is for you to kill that rat bastard Adam Driver." I'd say, what? Never. I would never turn on a king like that. And then I'd, just kill my own grandfather right there. Just unplug him. I'm not turning over Adam Driver. But my point is, Dante's is unwittingly guilty, but still guilty. However, the people who are declaring him guilty, Villefort, aren't calling him guilty because he did anything wrong. At the time, they did not know he had done anything wrong. Villefort only sends him to the Chateau d'If to save his own political ambitions. So, weirdly, at the same time, Dante's is innocent and guilty, and Adam Driver is just a gem. Go see any movie he's in. All right, let's get back to the story. This week, we're reading The Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 13, The 100 Days. Monsieur Noirtier was a true prophet, and things progressed rapidly, as he had predicted. Everyone knows the history of the famous return from Elba, a return which was unprecedented in the past and will probably remain without a counterpart in the future. Louis XVIII made but a faint attempt to parry this unexpected blow. The monarchy he had scarcely reconstructed tottered on its precarious foundation, and at a sign from the emperor, the incongruous structure of ancient prejudices and new ideas fell to the ground. Villefort, therefore, gained nothing save the king's gratitude, which was rather likely to injure him at the present time, and the cross of the Legion of Honor, which he had the prudence not to wear, although Monsieur de Blacas had duly forwarded the brevet. Napoleon would, doubtless, have deprived Villefort of his office had it not been for Noirtier, who was all-powerful at court, and thus the Girondin of '93 and the Senator of 1806 protected him who so lately had been his protector. All Villefort's influence barely enabled him to stifle the secret Dantes had so nearly divulged. The king's procureur alone was deprived of his office, being suspected of royalism. However, scarcely was the imperial power established, that is, scarcely had the emperor re-entered the Tuileries and began to issue orders from the closet into which we have introduced our readers, he found on the table there Louis's half-filled snuff-box. Scarcely had this occurred when Marseille began, in spite of the authorities, to rekindle the flames of civil war, always smoldering in the south, and it required but little to excite the populace to acts of far greater violence than the shouts and insults with which they assailed the royalists whenever they ventured abroad. Owing to this change, the worthy shipowner became at that moment, we will not say all-powerful, because Morel was prudent and rather a timid man, so much so that many of the most zealous partisans of Bonaparte accused him of moderation, but sufficiently influential to make a demand in favor of Dantes. Villefort retained his place, but his marriage was put off until a more favorable opportunity. If the emperor remained on the throne, Gerard required a different alliance to aid his career. If Louis returned, the influence of the Marquis de Saint-Méran, like his own, could be vastly increased, and the marriage be still more suitable. The deputy procureur was, therefore, the first magistrate of Marseille, when one morning his door opened, and Monsieur Morel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to receive him, but Villefort was a man of ability, and he knew this would be a sign of weakness. He made Morel wait in the antechamber, although he had no one with him, for the simple reason that the king's procureur always makes everyone wait, and after passing a quarter of an hour in reading the papers, he ordered Monsieur Morel to be admitted. Morel expected Villefort to be dejected. He found him as he had found him 6 weeks before, calm, firm, and full of that glacial politeness, that most insurmountable barrier which separates the well-bred from the vulgar man. He had entered Villefort's office expecting that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him. On the contrary, he felt a cold shudder all over him when he saw Villefort sitting there with his elbow on his desk and his head leaning on his hand. He stopped at the door. Villefort gazed at him as if he had some difficulty in recognizing him. Then, after a brief interval, during which the honest shipowner turned his hat in his hands, "Monsieur Morel, I believe?" said Villefort.
"Yes, sir."
"Come nearer," said the magistrate, with a patronizing wave of the hand,
"and tell me to what circumstance I owe the honor of this visit."
"Do you not guess, monsieur?"
asked Morel.
"Not in the least, but if I can serve you in any way, I shall be delighted."
"Everything depends on you."
"Explain yourself, pray."
"Monsieur,"
said Morel, recovering his assurance as he proceeded,
"do you recollect that a few days before the landing of His Majesty, I came to intercede for a young man, the mate of my ship, who was accused of being concerned in correspondence with the Isle of Elba? What was the other day a crime is today a title to favor. You then served Louis, and you did not show any favor. It was your duty. Today you serve Napoleon, and you ought to protect him. It is equally your duty. I come, therefore, to ask what has become of him?"
Villefort, by a strong effort, sought to control himself.
"What is his name?" said he. "Tell me his name."
Villefort would probably have rather stood opposite the muzzle of a pistol at 25 paces than have heard this name spoken, but he did not blanch.
"Dantes," repeated he. "Edmond Dantes."
Yes, monsieur.
Vilfert opened a large register, then went to a table. From the table, turned to his registers, and then, turning to Morel,
Are you quite sure that you are not mistaken, monsieur?
said he, in the most natural tone in the world. Had Morel been a more quick-sighted man, or better versed in these matters, he would have been surprised at the king's procureur answering him on such a subject, instead of referring him to the governors of the prison or the prefect of the department. But Morel, disappointed in his expectations of exciting fear, was conscious only of the other's condescension. Vilfert had calculated rightly.
No, said Morel, I am not mistaken. I have known him for 10 years, the last 4 of which he was in my service. Do not you recollect? I came about 6 weeks ago to plead for clemency, as I came today to plead for justice. You received me very coldly. Oh, the Royalists were very severe with the Bonapartists in those days.
Monsieur, returned Vilfert, I was then a royalist because I believed the Bourbons not only the heirs to the throne, but the chosen of the nation. The miraculous return of Napoleon has conquered me. The legitimate monarch is he who is loved by his people.
That's right,
cried Morel.
I like to hear you speak thus, and I augur well for Edmund from it.
Wait a moment,
said Vilfert, turning over the leaves of a register.
I have it, a sailor who was about to marry a young Catalan girl. I recollect now. It was a very serious charge.
How so?
You know that when he left here, he was taken to the palace to justice.
Well?
I made my report to the authorities at Paris, and a week after he was carried off.
Carried off?
Said Morel.
What can they have done with him?
Oh, he has been taken to Fenestrelles, to Pignerol, or to the St. Marguerite Islands. Some fine morning he will return to take command of your vessel.
Come when he will, it shall be kept for him. But how is it he is not already returned? It seems to me the first care of government should be to set at liberty those who have suffered for their adherence to it.
Do not be too hasty, Monsieur Morel, replied Vilfert. The order of imprisonment came from high authority, and the order for his liberation must proceed from the same source. And as Napoleon has scarcely been reinstated a fortnight, the letters have not yet been forwarded.
But, said Morel, is there no way of expediting all these formalities, of releasing him from arrest?
There has been no arrest.
How?
It is sometimes essential to government to cause a man's disappearance without leaving any traces, so that no written forms or documents may defeat their wishes.
It might be so under the Bourbons, but at present...
It has always been so, my dear Morel, since the reign of Louis. The emperor is more strict in prison discipline than even Louis himself, and the number of prisoners whose names are not on the register is incalculable.
Had Morel even any suspicions, so much kindness would have dispelled him.
Well, Monsieur de Vilfert, how would you advise me to act?
Asked he.
Petition the minister.
Oh, I know what that is. The minister receives 200 petitions every day and does not read 3.
That is true, but he will read a petition countersigned and presented by me.
And will you undertake to deliver it?
With the greatest pleasure. Dantes was then guilty, and now he is innocent, and it is as much my duty to free him as it was to condemn him.
Vilfert thus forestalled any danger of an inquiry, which, however improbable it might be, if it did take place, would leave him defenseless.
But how shall I address the minister?
Sit down there, said Vilfert, giving up his place to Morel, and write what I dictate.
Will you be so good?
Certainly, but lose no time. We have lost too much already.
That is true. Only think what the poor fellow may even now be suffering.
Vilfert shuddered at the suggestion, but he had gone too far to draw back. Dantes must be crushed to gratify Vilfert's ambition. Vilfert dictated a petition in which, from an excellent intention no doubt, Dante's patriotic services were exaggerated, and he was made out one of the most active agents of Napoleon's return. It was evident that at the sight of this document the minister would instantly release him. The petition finished, Vilfert read it out loud.
That will do, said he. Leave the rest to me.
Will the petition go soon?
Today.
Countersigned by you.
The best thing I can do will be to certify the truth of the contents of your petition.
And sitting down, Vilfert wrote the certificate at the bottom.
What more is to be done?
I will do whatever is necessary.
This assurance delighted Morel, who took leave of Villefort and hastened to announce to old Dantes that he would soon see his son. As for Villefort, instead of sending to Paris, he carefully preserved the petition that so fearfully compromised Dantes, in the hopes of an event that seemed not unlikely, that is, a second restoration. Dantes remained a prisoner, and heard not the noise of the fall of Louis's throne, or the still more tragic destruction of the empire. Twice during the 100 days had Morel renewed his demand, and twice had Villefort soothed him with promises. At last there was Waterloo, and Morel came no more. He had done all that was in his power, and any fresh attempt would only compromise himself uselessly. Louis XVIII remounted the throne. Villefort, to whom Marseille had become filled with remorseful memories, sought and obtained the situation of king's procureur at Toulouse, and a fortnight afterwards he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, whose father now stood higher at court than ever. And so Dantes, after the 100 days and after Waterloo, remained in his dungeon, forgotten of earth and heaven. Danglars comprehended the full extent of the wretched fate that overwhelmed Dantes, and when Napoleon returned to France, he, after the manner of mediocre minds, termed the coincidence a decree of Providence. But when Napoleon returned to Paris, Danglars' heart failed him, and he lived in constant fear of Dantes' return on a mission of vengeance. He therefore informed Monsieur Morel of his wish to quit the sea, and obtained a recommendation from him to a Spanish merchant, into whose service he entered at the end of March, that is, 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return. He then left for Madrid, and was no more heard of. Fernand understood nothing except that Dantes was absent. What had become of him he cared not to inquire. Only, during the respite the absence of his rival afforded him, he reflected, partly on the means of deceiving Mercédès as to the cause of his absence, partly on plans of emigration and abduction, as from time to time he sat sad and motionless on the summit of Cape Faro, at the spot from whence Marseille and the Catalans are visible, watching for the apparition of a young, handsome man who was for him also the messenger of vengeance. Fernand's mind was made up. He would shoot Dantes and then kill himself. But Fernand was mistaken. A man of his disposition never kills himself, for he constantly hopes. During this time, the empire made its last conscription, and every man in France capable of bearing arms rushed to obey the summons of the emperor. Fernand departed with the rest, bearing with him the terrible thought that while he was away, his rival would perhaps return and marry Mercédès. Had Fernand really meant to kill himself, he would have done so when he parted from Mercédès. His devotion and the compassion he showed for her misfortunes produced the effect they always produce on noble minds. Mercédès had always had a sincere regard for Fernand, and this was now strengthened by gratitude. "My brother," said she as she placed his knapsack on his shoulders, "be careful for yourself, for if you are killed I shall be alone in the world." These words carried a ray of hope into Fernand's heart. Should Dantes not return, Mercédès might one day be his. Mercédès was left alone face to face with the vast plain that had never seemed so barren, and the sea that had never seemed so vast. Bathed in tears, she wandered about the Catalan village. Sometimes she stood mute and motionless as a statue, looking towards Marseille. At other times, gazing on the sea and debating as to whether it were not better to cast herself into the abyss of the ocean, and thus end her woes. It was not want of courage that prevented her putting this resolution into execution, but her religious feelings came to her aid and saved her. Caderousse was, like Fernand, enrolled in the army, but being married and 8 years older, he was merely sent to the frontier. Old Dantes, who was only sustained by hope, lost all hope at Napoleon's downfall. 5 months after he had been separated from his sons, and almost at the hour of his arrest, he breathed his last in Mercédès' arms. Monsieur Morel paid the expenses of his funeral and a few small debts the poor old man had contracted. There was more than benevolence in this action. There was courage. The South was aflame, and to assist, even on his deathbed, the father of so dangerous a Bonapartist as Dantes, was stigmatized as a crime. Chapter 14. The Two Prisoners. A year after Louis XVIII's restoration, a visit was made by the Inspector General of Prisons. Dantes, in his cell, heard the noise of preparation, sounds that at the depth where he lay would have been inaudible to any but the ear of a prisoner, who could hear the splash of the drop of water that every hour fell from the roof of his dungeon. He guessed something uncommon was passing among the living, but he had so long ceased to have any intercourse with the world that he looked upon himself as dead. The inspector visited, one after another, the cells and dungeons of several of the prisoners, whose good behavior or stupidity recommended them to the clemency of the government. He inquired how they were fed, and if they had any requests to make. The universal response was that the fare was detestable and that they wanted to be set free. The inspector asked if they had anything else to ask for. They shook their heads. What could they desire beyond their liberty? The inspector turned smilingly to the governor.
I do not know what reason government can assign for these useless visits. When you see one prisoner, you see all. Always the same thing, ill-fed and innocent. Are there any others?
Yes, the dangerous and mad prisoners are in the dungeons.
Let us visit them, said the inspector with an air of fatigue. We must play the farce to the end. Let us see the dungeons.
Let us first send for 2 soldiers, said the governor. The prisoners sometimes, through mere uneasiness of life, and in order to be sentenced to death, commit acts of useless violence, and you might fall victim.
Take all needful precautions, replied the inspector.
2 soldiers were accordingly sent for, and the inspector descended a stairway so foul, so humid, so dark, as to be loathsome to sight, smell, and respiration.
Ah, cried the inspector, who can live here?
A most dangerous conspirator, a man we are ordered to keep the most strict watch over, as he is daring and resolute.
He is alone?
Certainly.
How long has he been there?
Nearly a year.
Was he placed here when he first arrived?
No, not until he attempted to kill the turnkey who took his food to him.
To kill the turnkey?
Yes, the very one who is lighting us. Is it not true, Antoine? Asked the governor.
True enough. He wanted to kill me, returned the turnkey.
He must be mad, said the inspector.
He is worse than that. He is a devil, returned the turnkey.
Shall I complain of him? Demanded the inspector. Oh, no, it is useless. Besides, he is almost mad now, and in another year he will be quite so.
So much the better for him. He will suffer less, said the inspector. He was, as this remark shows, a man full of philanthropy and in every way fit for his office.
You are right, sir, replied the governor, and this remark proves that you have deeply considered the subject. Now we have in a dungeon about 20 feet distant, into which you descend by another stair, an old abbé, formerly leader of a party in Italy, who has been here since 1811, and in 1813 he went mad, and the change is astonishing. He used to weep, he now laughs. He grew thin, he now grows fat. You had better see him, for his madness is amusing.
I will see them both, returned the inspector. I must conscientiously perform my duty.
This was the inspector's first visit. He wished to display his authority.
Let us visit this one first.
By all means, replied the governor, and he signed to the turnkey to open the door. At the sound of the key turning in the lock and the creaking of the hinges, Dantes, who was crouched in a corner of the dungeon, whence he could see the ray of light that came through a narrow iron grating above, raised his head.
Seeing a stranger, escorted by 2 turnkeys holding torches and accompanied by 2 soldiers, and to whom the governor spoke bareheaded, Dantes, who had guessed the truth, and at that moment to address himself to the superior authorities was come, sprang forward with clasped hands. The soldiers interposed their bayonets, for they thought that he was about to attack the inspector, and the latter recoiled 2 or 3 steps. Dante saw that he was looked upon as dangerous. Then, infusing all the humility he possessed into his eyes and voice, he addressed the inspector and sought to inspire him with pity. The inspector listened attentively. Then, turning to the governor, observed, "He will become religious. He's already more gentle. He's afraid and retreated before the bayonets. Madmen are not afraid of anything. I made some curious observations on this at Charenton." Then, turning to the prisoner, "What is it you want?" said he.
"I want to know what crime I've committed, to be tried, and if I am guilty, to be shot, if innocent, to be set at liberty."
"Are you well fed?" said the inspector.
"I believe so. I don't know. It's of no consequence. What matters really, not only to me, but to the officers of justice and the king, is that an innocent man should languish in prison, the victim of an infamous denunciation, to die here cursing his executioners." "You are very humble today," remarked the governor. "You are not so always. The other day, for instance, when you tried to kill the turnkey." "It is true, sir, and I beg his pardon, for he has always been very good to me. But I was mad." "And you are not so any longer?" "No. Captivity has subdued me. I have been here so long."
"So long? When were you arrested, then?" said the inspector.
"The 28th of February, 1815, at 2:30 in the afternoon."
"Today is the 30th of July, 1816. Why, it is but 17 months."
"Only 17 months," replied Dantes. "You do not know what is 17 months in prison. 17 ages, rather, especially to a man who, like me, had arrived at the summit of his ambition, to a man who, like me, was on the point of marrying a woman he adored, who saw an honorable career open before him, and who loses all in an instant, who sees his prospects destroyed, and is ignorant of the fate of his affianced wife, and whether his aged father be still living. 17 months' captivity to a sailor accustomed to the boundless ocean is a worse punishment than human crime ever merited. Have pity on me, then, and ask for me, not intelligence, but a trial. Not pardon, but a verdict. A trial, sir. I ask only for a trial, that surely cannot be denied to one who is accused."
"We shall see,"
said the inspector. Then, turning to the governor,
"On my word, the poor devil touches me. You must show me the proofs against him."
"Certainly, but you will find terrible charges." "Monsieur," continued Dantes, "I know it is not in your power to release me, but you can plead for me. You can have me tried, and that is all I ask. Let me know my crime and the reason why I was condemned. Uncertainty is worse than all."
"Go on with the lights," said the inspector.
"Monsieur," cried Dantes, "I can tell by your voice you are touched with pity. Tell me at least a hope." "I cannot tell you that," replied the inspector. "I can only promise to examine into your case." "Oh, I'm free! Then I'm saved!" "Who arrested you?" "Villefort. See him and hear what he says."
"Villefort is no longer at Marseille. He is now at Toulouse."
"I am no longer surprised at my detention," murmured Dantes, "since my only protector is removed."
"Had Monsieur de Villefort any cause of personal dislike to you?"
"None. On the contrary, he was very kind to me."
"I can then only rely on the notes he has left concerning you."
"Entirely."
"That is well. Wait patiently, then."
Dantes fell on his knees and prayed earnestly. The door closed, but this time a fresh inmate was left with Dantes. Hope. "Will you see the register at once?" asked the governor, "or proceed to the other cell?"
"Let us visit them all," said the inspector. "If I once went up those stairs, I should never have the courage to come down again."
"Ah, this one is not like the other, and his madness is less affecting than this one's display of reason."
"What's his folly?"
"He fancies he possesses an immense treasure. The first year he offered government 1,000,000 francs for his release, the second 2, the third 3, and so on progressively. He is now in his 5th year of captivity. He will ask to speak to you in private and offer you 5,000,000.
"How curious. What's his name?"
"The Abbé Faria."
"Number 27?" said the inspector.
"It is here. Unlock the door, Antoine." The turnkey obeyed, and the inspector gazed curiously into the chamber of the mad abbé. In the center of the cell, in a circle traced with a fragment of plaster detached from the wall, sat a man whose tattered garments scarcely covered him. He was drawing in this circle geometrical lines, and seemed as much absorbed in his problems as Archimedes was when the soldier of Marcellus slew him. He did not move at the sound of the door, and continued his calculations until the flash of the torches lighted up with an unwonted glare the somber walls of his cell. Then, raising his head, he perceived with astonishment the number of persons present. He hastily seized the coverlet of his bed and wrapped it around him.
"What is it you want?"
said the inspector. "I, monsieur?" replied the abbé with an air of surprise. "I want nothing." "You do not understand," continued the inspector. "I am sent here by government to visit the prison and hear the requests of the prisoners." Ah, that is different, cried the abbe, and we shall understand each other, I hope. There now, whispered the governor, it is just as I told you. Monsieur, continued the prisoner, I am the Abbe Faria, born at Rome. I was for 20 years Cardinal Spada's secretary. I was arrested, why, I know not, towards the beginning of the year 1811. Since then, I have demanded my liberty from the French and Italian governments. Why from the French government? Because I was arrested at Piombino, and I presume that, like Milan and Florence, Piombino has become the capital of some French department. Ah, said the inspector, you have not the latest news from Italy? My information dates from the day on which I was arrested, returned the Abbé Faria, and as the emperor had created the kingdom of Rome for his infant son, I presume that he has realized the dream of Machiavelli and Caesar Borgia, which was to make Italy a united kingdom. Monsieur, returned the inspector, Providence has changed this gigantic plan you advocate so warmly. It is the only means of rendering Italy strong, happy, and independent. Very possibly, only I am not come to discuss politics, but to inquire if you have anything to ask of, or to complain about. The food is the same as in other prisons, that is, very bad. The lodging is very unhealthful, but, on the whole, passable for a dungeon. But it is not that which I wish to speak of, but a secret I have to reveal of the greatest importance. We are coming to the point, whispered the governor. It is for that reason I am delighted to see you, continued the abbé, although you have disturbed me in a most important calculation, which, if it succeeded, would possibly change Newton's system. Could you allow me a few words in private? What did I tell you? Said the governor. You knew him, returned the inspector with a smile. What you ask is impossible, monsieur, continued he, addressing Faria. But, said the abbé, I would speak to you of a very large sum, amounting to 5 millions. The very sum you named, whispered the inspector in his turn. However, continued Faria, seeing that the inspector was about to depart, it is not absolutely necessary for us to be alone. The governor can be present. Unfortunately, said the governor, I know beforehand what you are about to say. It concerns your treasures, does it not? Faria fixed his eyes on him with an expression that would have convinced anyone else of his sanity. Of course, said he. Of what else should I speak? Mr. Inspector, continued the governor, I can tell you the story as well as he, for it has been dinned in my ears for the last 4 or 5 years. That proves, returned the abbé, that you are not like those of Holy Writ, who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not. My dear sir, the government is rich and does not want your treasures, replied the inspector. Keep them until you are liberated. The abbé's eyes glistened. He seized the inspector's hand. But what if I am not liberated, cried he, and am detained here until my death? This treasure will be lost. Had not government better profit by it? I will offer 6 million, and I will content myself with the rest, if they only give me my liberty. On my word, said the inspector in a low tone, had I not been told beforehand that this man was mad, I should have believed what he says. I am not mad, replied Faria, with that acuteness of hearing peculiar to prisoners. The treasure I speak of really exists, and I offer to sign an agreement with you, in which I promise to lead you to the spot where you shall dig, and if I deceive you, bring me here again. I ask no more. The governor laughed. Is the spot far from here? 100 leagues. It is not ill-planned, said the governor. If all the prisoners took it into their heads to travel 100 leagues, and their guardians consented to accompany them, they would have a capital chance of escaping. The scheme is well known, said the inspector, and the abbé's plan has not even the merit of originality. Then, turning to Faria, I inquired if you were well fed, said he. Swear to me, replied Faria, to free me if what I tell you prove true, and I will stay here while you go to the spot. Are you well fed? Repeated the inspector. Monsieur, you run no risk, for, as I told you, I will stay here, so there is no chance of my escaping."
"You do not reply to my question," replied the inspector impatiently.
"Nor you to mine," cried the abbé. "You will not accept my gold? I will keep it for myself. You refuse me my liberty? God will give it to me." And the abbé, casting away his coverlet, resumed his place and continued his calculations. "What's he doing there?" said the inspector. "Counting his treasures," replied the governor. Faria replied to this sarcasm with a glance of profound contempt. They went out. The turnkey closed the door behind them. "He was wealthy once, perhaps?" said the inspector. "Or dreamed he was, and woke mad." "After all," said the inspector, "if he had been rich, he would not have been here." So the matter ended for the Abbé Faria. He remained in his cell, and this visit only increased the belief in his insanity. Caligula or Nero, those treasure-seekers, those desirers of the impossible, would have accorded to the poor wretch, in exchange for his wealth, the liberty he so earnestly prayed for. But the kings of modern times, restrained by the limits of mere probability, have neither courage nor desire. They fear the ear that hears their orders, and the eye that scrutinizes their actions. Formerly, they believed themselves sprung from Jupiter and shielded by their birth, but nowadays they are not inviolable. It has always been against the policy of despotic governments to suffer the victims of their persecutions to reappear. As the Inquisition rarely allowed its victims to be seen with their limbs distorted and their flesh lacerated by torture, so madness is always concealed in its cell, from whence, should it depart, it is conveyed to some gloomy hospital, where the doctor has no thought for man or mind in the mutilated being the jailer delivers to him. The very madness of the Abbé Faria, gone mad in prison, condemned him to perpetual captivity. The inspector kept his word with Dantes. He examined the register and found the following note concerning him. Edmond Dantes, violent Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from Elba. The greatest watchfulness and care to be exercised. This note was in a different hand from the rest, which showed that it had been added since his confinement. The inspector could not contend against this accusation. He simply wrote, "Nothing to be done." This visit had infused new vigor into Dantes. He had, till then, forgotten the date, but now, with a fragment of plaster, he wrote the date, the 30th of July, 1816, and made a mark every day, in order not to lose his reckoning again. Days and weeks passed away, then months. Dantes still waited. He at first expected to be freed in a fortnight. This fortnight expired. He decided that the inspector would do nothing until his return to Paris, and that he would not reach there until his circuit was finished. He therefore fixed 3 months. 3 months passed away, then 6 more. Finally, 10 months and a half had gone by, and no favorable change had taken place, and Dantes began to fancy the inspector's visit but a dream, an illusion of the brain. At the expiration of a year, the governor was transferred. He had obtained charge of the fortress at Hum. He took with him several of his subordinates, and amongst them Dantes' jailer. A new governor arrived. It would have been too tedious to acquire the names of the prisoners. He learned their numbers instead. This horrible place contained 50 cells. Their inhabitants were designated by the numbers of their cell, and the unhappy young man was no longer called Edmond Dantes. He was now number 34. End of chapter 14. And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.